At my sister's lavish wedding, my parents demanded I surrender my mansion to her. When I refused, she slapped me, and everyone laughed. They thought I was just the obedient, silent daughter, so I triggered a trap that ruined them completely. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The pounding bass from the grand ballroom below felt like a physical assault against my skull. I was sitting on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge in the opulent, gold-leafed bridal suite, shivering despite the stifling heat of the late summer evening. A severe, stress-induced fever had been ravaging my body for 3 days, a direct consequence of the 90-hour work weeks I had endured to finalize the sale of my software company's latest artificial intelligence platform. I had dragged myself out of bed, pumped my system full of fever reducers, and poured myself into a designer gown I could barely stand up in, all because my family demanded my presence. I was the eldest daughter. I was the ATM. I was expected to be there, smiling and silent. My vision blurred slightly as the heavy oak door of the suite clicked shut, locking out the sounds of the 250 guests clinking champagne flutes downstairs. I looked up, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from my forehead, to see my mother, Natalia, and my father, Bennett, standing over me. They didn't look concerned about my pale skin or my trembling hands. They looked like predators who had finally cornered their exhausted prey. Natalia smoothed the front of her obscenely expensive mother-of-the-bride dress, a dress I had paid for, naturally, and crossed her arms. Her expression was devoid of the warmth a mother should have for a sick child. Bennett stood slightly behind her, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored tuxedo, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. "We need to discuss your wedding gift to Vanessa," Natalia began, her voice a low, calculated hum that immediately set my teeth on edge. I blinked, trying to focus through the haze of my migraine. "My gift? Mom, I already paid for the floral arrangements." I covered the catering when Bennett's credit card was declined last week. I wrote a check for $20,000. What more is there to discuss? "That was your contribution to the event," Bennett interrupted, his tone sharp and dismissive. "We are talking about your gift to the bride and groom, a foundation for their new life together." "Vanessa is 25, I said, my voice raspy. "She has a degree I financed. She has a car I bought her. What exactly does she need?" Natalia took a step closer, her eyes flashing with a terrifying sense of entitlement. "She needs a home, Caroline, a proper home to start a family. Marcus is a visionary, but his capital is tied up in offshore investments right now. They can't be expected to live in a cramped apartment. It's embarrassing." A knot of pure dread began to tighten in my stomach. The nausea I was feeling suddenly had nothing to do with my fever. "Okay," I said slowly, choosing my words with extreme caution. "So, help them with a down payment. You remortgaged your house 3 years ago. Where did that money go?" "Don't change the subject," Bennett snapped, taking a threatening step forward. "We have already made the arrangements. We told Vanessa and Marcus that you would be transferring the deed to the Rosewood property to them by the end of the month." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The Rosewood property wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary. It was a sprawling, beautifully restored 1920s Victorian mansion sitting on 3 acres of pristine woodland. I had bought it in cash after my first major tech buyout. It was the physical manifestation of every sleepless night, every panic attack, every tear I had shed building my empire from nothing while they ignored me to coddle Vanessa. "You did what?" I whispered, my voice breaking. The sheer audacity of their demand paralyzed me. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. "Don't act so dramatic, Caroline," Natalia scoffed, rolling her eyes as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a toy. "You are a single woman. You work constantly. You don't even use all those rooms. It's selfish, quite frankly, to hoard a property like that when your sister is trying to build a family. Selfish daughters don't deserve success. You will sign the house over to a trust in Marcus's name." "It's the right thing to do." I stared at the two people who had brought me into this world. They weren't asking. They were demanding the theft of my greatest achievement, to hand it over to a sister who had never worked a day in her life, and a man I barely knew. The physical illness ravaging my body suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the agonizing pain blooming in my chest. I realized in that suffocating room that they did not love me. They only loved what they could extract from me. The betrayal cut deeper than the fever burning in my veins. I don't remember exactly how I managed to stand up, but the survival instinct that had driven me to succeed in the cutthroat tech industry suddenly overrode my physical collapse. I pushed past them without a word, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Caroline, we are not finished here." Bennett barked, his voice echoing in the plush hallway as I practically stumbled out of the suite. I didn't look back. I gripped the ornate wooden banister of the sweeping staircase, forcing myself to descend into the sea of guests. The ballroom was a sensory overload of flashing lights, clinking glass, and deafening music. Everywhere I looked, I saw the money I had bled to earn being squandered on a fantasy for the golden child. I navigated through the crowd, my mind racing back to a bizarre phone call I had received from Vanessa exactly 3 weeks prior. At the time, I had dismissed it as her usual self-centered rambling, but now the memory played back in my mind with horrifying clarity. I had been in the middle of a critical board meeting when my personal cell rang. Seeing Vanessa's name, I stepped out, assuming it was a wedding emergency. Instead, her voice had been dripping with a sickly sweet, artificial warmth. "Caro. Hi, quick question," she had chirped over the line, the sound of a nail salon buzzing in the background. "What are the exact property taxes on Rosewood, and do you have the original blueprints?" Marcus was just asking about the structural integrity of the West Wing. Why does Marcus care about my West Wing? I had asked, rubbing my temples in annoyance. Oh, he's just a real estate buff. He loves historic homes, just curious. Anyway, gotta go, my gel top coat is drying, love you. She hadn't been curious, they had been appraising it. They had been measuring the drapes for a house they fully intended to steal from me. As I reached the edge of the dance floor, I saw her. Vanessa, the radiant bride. She was swathed in $10,000 worth of imported silk and French lace, laughing uproariously with her bridesmaids. When she caught sight of me, standing there pale and trembling, her smile instantly vanished. The mask of the joyful bride slipped, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated coldness. She looked me up and down with utter contempt, then deliberately turned her back to me, raising her champagne glass to toast one of her friends. She knew. She absolutely knew what our parents were doing upstairs. In fact, she had probably orchestrated the entire ambush. She expected me to just roll over and surrender my life's work, just like I had surrendered my childhood, my peace of mind, and my savings to keep this dysfunctional family afloat. They truly believed I was weak because I had always chosen the path of least resistance to buy their temporary affection. They thought my silence was submission. I felt a strange, chilling calm wash over me, cooling the feverish heat of my skin. My panic began to crystallize into something sharp, cold, and devastatingly precise. I watched my family laughing, completely oblivious to the catastrophic miscalculation they had just made. They thought they held all the cards because they held the emotional leverage. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. To understand the sheer magnitude of their audacity, you have to understand the history of my bank account. I didn't just stumble into wealth. I clawed my way to it while simultaneously carrying the dead weight of my entire family. When I was 19, I was working 3 minimum wage jobs to pay for my computer science degree because Bennett had gambled away my college fund on a surefire stock tip that went bankrupt. When I was 24, I lived on ramen noodles in a studio apartment without heating so I could pay off the secret credit card debt Natalia had racked up buying designer bags, just to save them from foreclosure. And Vanessa? Vanessa was the altar upon which my parents sacrificed my future. When she wanted to go to a private, out-of-state liberal arts college, they wept and begged me to co-sign the loans. When she wanted her teeth perfectly veneered, I footed the bill. I gave and gave, fueled by a desperate, pathetic hope that one day they would look at me with the same starry-eyed adoration they reserved for my sister. But the more I succeeded, the more they resented me. My independence was a mirror that reflected their own failures, and their only way to cope was to treat my money as communal family property. And then came Marcus. I spotted him near the ice sculpture, holding court with a group of Bennett's old golf buddies. Marcus was 32, but he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a billionaire. He was undeniably handsome in a highly manufactured way, slicked back hair, a jawline that looked surgically enhanced, and a tuxedo that was a little too tight, tailored to show off his physique. But it was his eyes that always unsettled me. They were dead, calculating, and always scanning the room for the most valuable person to latch onto. When Vanessa first brought him home 8 months ago, I immediately ran a background check. It was a habit I had developed in the corporate world. What I found was a ghost. Marcus claimed to be a high-level wealth management consultant for international clients, but he had zero digital footprint, no registered business licenses, and a credit score that was practically non-existent. When I raised these red flags to Natalia, she accused me of being a jealous, bitter spinster trying to ruin her sister's happiness. I watched him now, stepping away from the older men and making a beeline toward me. He moved with a predatory grace. "Caroline," he purred, stopping far too close to me. He smelled overwhelmingly of expensive, spicy cologne. He reached out, his hand wrapping around my bare arm. His grip was uncomfortably tight. "You look flushed. Are you handling the excitement well?" "I'm fine, Marcus." "Just a little tired," I said, pulling my arm away from his grasp. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I understand. You work so hard. Too hard, really. A woman like you shouldn't be burdening herself with the stress of managing such a massive estate like Rosewood all alone. It ages a person." I stared at him, my jaw clenching. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "It's a lot of upkeep," he continued, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. "The property taxes alone must be a nightmare. I was actually discussing it with Bennett earlier. We were talking about asset protection. Is the deed held in your personal name, or do you have it shielded under a corporate LLC? You know, in case of unforeseen liabilities." He was probing. He was trying to figure out exactly how difficult it would be to transfer the title. The sheer greed radiating off of him was nauseating. He looked at me not as a sister-in-law, but as an obstacle standing between him and a multi-million-dollar payday. "My assets are perfectly secure, Marcus," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "They are locked down in ways you couldn't possibly comprehend. So I suggest you stop worrying about my property and start worrying about how you're going to afford the lifestyle my sister expects." For a fraction of a second, the suave mask slipped. A look of genuine, ugly malice flashed across his face, his upper lip twitching in a sneer. But just as quickly, the fake smile returned. "We're family now, Caroline," he whispered, leaning in so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. "And in this family, we take care of each other, whether you like it or not. I think you'll find it's much easier to just let go." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of dancers. I stood there, the fever raging in my blood, completely surrounded by people, yet entirely alone. They had laid out their plan. They intended to break me down, legally or emotionally, until I handed over my home. They thought I was trapped by my lifelong habit of submission. But as I looked around the lavish hall that I had paid for, watching the people who despised me drink my champagne, I made a decision. I was done being the victim. I was done being the ATM. If they wanted a war over my assets, I was going to give them a massacre. I stood at the edge of the dance floor for what felt like an eternity, the heavy bass of the wedding band vibrating through the floorboards and up into my aching legs. The fever was still burning behind my eyes, but a new sensation was taking over, a cold, sharp clarity. I watched my parents laughing with Vanessa, their faces flushed with expensive champagne and the arrogant satisfaction of a plan well executed. They truly believed I was already defeated. Before I could slip out the side exit and escape into the cool night air, the music abruptly stopped. The sudden silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. Bennett was standing on the elevated stage where the band had been playing, tapping a silver spoon against a crystal champagne flute. The sharp clink, clink, clink drew the attention of all 250 guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bennett announced, his voice booming through the microphone, dripping with a sickeningly sweet false joviality. "If I could have your attention for just a moment. As the father of the bride, my heart is overflowing with joy tonight. We have celebrated the union of my beautiful Vanessa and the brilliant Marcus." The crowd erupted into polite applause. Vanessa beamed, leaning her head against Marcus's shoulder while he kissed her hair, playing the role of the devoted groom flawlessly. "But," Bennett continued, raising his hand to quiet the room, his eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto me, standing alone by the exit. A predatory smile stretched across his face. "This night wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the incredible generosity of my eldest daughter, Caroline. She couldn't give a traditional speech tonight because she's feeling slightly under the weather, but she has prepared a surprise that will truly set a new standard for sibling devotion." I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I could feel the eyes of 250 people turning toward me. "Caroline," Bennett called out, gesturing for me to step forward. "Why don't you come up here and present your sister with the ultimate wedding gift?" "Ladies and gentlemen, Caroline has graciously decided to sign over the deed to her magnificent Rosewood estate to the happy couple, ensuring they have the perfect foundation to build their family." The ballroom erupted in gasps of awe and thunderous applause. People I hadn't seen in a decade were beaming at me, raising their glasses. It was a masterclass in emotional blackmail. By announcing it publicly, they were trapping me. If I agreed, I lost my home. If I refused, I was the villain who ruined the golden child's perfect day. I didn't walk to the stage. I stood my ground, my hands clenching into fists so tight my nails dug into my palms. The silence stretched. The applause died down to an uncomfortable murmur. Vanessa's smile faltered. She dropped Marcus's arm and marched across the dance floor toward me, the heavy silk of her gown sweeping the floor. "Caro," she hissed under her breath as she reached me, her eyes wide with manufactured panic, loud enough for the first few rows of tables to hear. "Don't do this. Don't embarrass us. Just nod and play along. We have the papers upstairs." I looked at my sister, taking in her perfectly contoured face and the frantic greed in her eyes. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried perfectly in the hushed room. Vanessa blinked, clearly not comprehending the word. "What?" "I said no," I repeated, my voice growing stronger, the feverish haze entirely gone. "I am not giving you my house, Vanessa. I am not giving you my sanctuary so you can play house with a grifter. There is no deed, there is no gift, you get nothing." The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. I saw Bennett turn purple on the stage. Natalia covered her mouth in feigned horror. Vanessa's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. The spoiled princess, denied her prize for the very first time in her life, snapped. She raised her hand, heavily adorned with a custom-designed diamond ring I had practically financed, and struck me across the face. The crack of the slap echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The force of the blow snapped my head to the side. A sharp, stinging pain exploded across my cheek, and the metallic taste of blood instantly filled my mouth where my teeth had caught my inner lip. I slowly turned my head back to look at her. For a split second, there was dead silence. And then, from the table closest to us, where Bennett's golf buddies and their over-Botoxed wives were seated, a low chuckle broke the tension. It was followed by another. And then, a wave of cruel, alcohol-fueled laughter rippled through the room. They weren't laughing at Vanessa's assault. They were laughing at me. The pathetic, workaholic spinster sister getting put in her place for daring to ruin the vibe of the lavish party. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply wiped a drop of blood from the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand, looked Vanessa dead in the eye, and walked out the door. The drive back to Rosewood was a blur of rain and neon streetlights. By the time I pulled my car into the long, winding driveway of my estate, the emotional paralysis had completely dissolved, leaving behind a burning, hyper-focused energy. I walked through the grand mahogany front doors of my home, tossing my heels aside, and marched straight into my home office. My family thought I was just a software architect. They thought I just wrote code. They had no idea how Vertex Holdings, the firm I founded, actually generated its capital. We didn't just build predictive AI models. We used those models to identify, purchase, and restructure distressed private debt. I sat at my massive desk, booted up my encrypted server, and logged into the firm's private network. My fingers flew across the keyboard. 6 months ago, out of a misguided sense of protective duty, I had run a deep-dive financial analysis on my parents. I knew they were bad with money, but the reality had been staggering. They were drowning. To maintain the illusion of extreme wealth for Vanessa's benefit, Bennett had taken out a massive, predatory secondary mortgage on their home. When I saw the horrific interest rates, I had quietly used a shell corporation under Vertex Holdings to purchase that debt. I didn't do it to hurt them. I did it to ensure the bank wouldn't throw them on the street when they inevitably defaulted. I was acting as their secret safety net. Furthermore, when Vanessa had chosen the elitist, impossibly expensive country club for her wedding venue, I had run a background check on the property. The venue's parent company was heavily leveraged and facing bankruptcy. 2 months ago, Vertex Holdings acquired a controlling share of that parent company to restructure it. I stared at the glowing monitors in the dark room. I owned the paper on my parents' house. I owned the ground they had just laughed at me on. I held the keys to their entire existence. The trap was already set. I just hadn't planned on springing it. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the direct line for Elias, my firm's lead corporate investigator and head of security. He answered on the first ring, despite it being past midnight. "Caroline, is everything all right?" Elias asked, his gruff voice laced with immediate concern. "I need you to open a full, unrestricted dossier on a man named Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as ice. "He just married my sister. I want his real name, his offshore accounts, his credit history, his associates, and every lie he's ever told. Spare no expense, Elias. I want him dismantled." "Consider it done," Elias replied. "I'll have the preliminary data by sunrise." The sun had barely breached the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the meticulously manicured lawns of rosewood, when the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to pound incessantly. I was already awake. I hadn't slept a wink. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee, dressed in a sharp, tailored business suit. The fever was gone, replaced by an adrenaline high that made my senses razor-sharp. I walked to the foyer and swung the heavy oak door open. Standing on my front porch, looking infuriated and slightly hungover, were Natalia, Bennett, Vanessa, and Marcus. Behind them, standing awkwardly on the steps holding a leather briefcase, was a man I recognized as Bennett's longtime lawyer and golf buddy, Arthur. They had literally brought a notary to my house the morning after a wedding. "Do you have any idea how much embarrassment you caused us last night?" Natalia hissed, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. The others followed suit, filing into my home as if they owned it. Bennett glared at me, his eyes bloodshot. "Your little stunt was uncalled for, Caroline. We had to spend the rest of the evening doing damage control, telling people you had a mental breakdown from work stress. Now, we are going to fix this. Arthur has the transfer documents. You are going to sign them, right now, and we can put this ugly incident behind us." Vanessa stood next to Marcus, clutching his arm, looking at me with a mixture of defiance and expectation. She didn't apologize for the slap. The faint red mark was still visible on my cheek, but she didn't even acknowledge it. "There will be no signing, Bennett," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the entryway console table. My calm demeanor seemed to infuriate them even more. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little," Bennett started, taking a threatening step forward. "No, you listen to me," I interrupted, my voice cracking like a whip, echoing off the high ceilings. The sheer authority in my tone stopped him dead in his tracks. "You came into my home. You brought a lawyer to pressure me into signing away a multi-million-dollar asset to a man who couldn't afford to buy a used Honda Civic, let alone manage a historic estate. Marcus let out a forced, condescending laugh. Caroline, really? Your paranoia is getting the better of you. My assets are currently tied up in a complex international holding company. It's a liquidity issue, not a wealth issue. You simply don't understand high-level finance. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. Really? Because at 4:00 a.m. this morning, my investigative team pulled the records on your international holding company. It doesn't exist, Marcus. Or should I call you Mark Vance? The color instantly drained from Marcus's artificially tanned face. He took a subtle half-step backward. What is she talking about, Marcus? Vanessa asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. I didn't break eye contact with him. Mark Vance, originally from Ohio. You have exactly $412 in your primary checking account. You have 3 maxed-out credit cards in collection and a string of evicted apartments spanning 3 states. Your wealth management consulting is a front. You're a parasite who finds vulnerable, wealthy families and bleeds them dry. That's a lie. Natalia shrieked, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. Marcus is a visionary. You're just jealous of Vanessa's happiness. Marcus recovered his composure, though his eyes were now darting nervously around the room. His suave demeanor vanished, replaced by a thuggish aggression. You think you can hack my private data and get away with it? He spat, pointing a finger at me. I'll sue you for defamation. I'll take your company. I'll ruin you. You have no idea who you're messing with, you arrogant bitch. I welcome the lawsuit, I replied calmly. In fact, I insist you file it. Discovery will be fascinating. Because right now, I hold the evidence of your wire fraud, your forged documents, and your complete lack of financial solvency. But go ahead, Marcus. Make a threat in front of a licensed attorney. I gestured toward Arthur, who was suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable, clutching his briefcase against his chest. Vanessa was hyperventilating, looking frantically between me and her new husband. Tell me she's lying, Marcus. Tell me she's just being an evil, jealous sister. She's insane, Vanessa, Marcus snapped, grabbing her arm roughly. We're leaving. I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by a lonely spinster who has to pay for company. He practically dragged Vanessa out the door. Natalia and Bennett stood frozen in shock for a moment. Bennett looked at me, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, rage, denial, and a tiny, creeping seed of doubt. You are sick, Caroline, Natalia whispered, shaking her head. You are deeply, deeply sick. Don't ever contact us again until you are ready to beg for our forgiveness. They turned and marched out, the lawyer scurrying behind them. As the heavy door clicked shut, the silence of my home returned. They had rejected the truth to protect their delusion. The first blow had been struck, but the foundation of their lies was still standing. It was time to bring out the wrecking ball. Over the next 48 hours, the harassment escalated to a fever pitch. My phone was a constant barrage of vitriol. Natalia left voicemails accusing me of trying to destroy her family out of spite. Bennett sent threatening emails, claiming he was consulting with a new legal team to find a way to contest my ownership of Rosewood, citing undue influence and my supposed mental instability. Marcus, meanwhile, tried a different tactic. He began sending me anonymous, encrypted messages threatening to leak fabricated stories to the tech press about Vertex Holdings engaging in illegal data mining. He was desperate, thrashing blindly to regain control of the narrative, completely unaware that he was throwing punches at a brick wall. Every message, every threat, was immediately logged, traced, and added to the growing mountain of evidence Elias was compiling. On the third day, the narrative shifted slightly. Vanessa called me. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the recording. Caro, please, she sobbed into the phone, her voice sounding genuinely frayed. Marcus is so stressed because of your lies, you're ruining our honeymoon phase. He says you're trying to frame him. Mom and Dad are fighting constantly about money because of the stress you caused. If you just apologize and sign the house over, we can all go back to normal. Please, Caro, stop being so selfish. She was still utterly brainwashed. She was standing in a burning building, blaming the fire alarm for the smoke. It solidified my resolve. I couldn't just tell them the truth. I had to show them the ashes of their own creation. Later that afternoon, Elias arrived at my home office. He didn't say a word as he walked in, simply dropping a massive 3-inch thick manila folder onto my mahogany desk with a heavy thud. "You hit the jackpot, Caroline," Elias said, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite me. He looked exhausted but grimly satisfied. "The guy isn't just a grifter, he's a career criminal, and he's sloppy." I pulled the folder toward me and flipped it open. The smell of fresh ink and ozone rose from the pages. The first document was a background report from the state of Florida. "Walk me through it," I said, my eyes scanning the heavily highlighted text. "Mark Vance. He targets upper-middle-class families desperate to maintain social status. He preys on the parents' vanity and the daughter's entitlement," Elias explained, pointing to a series of court dockets. 3 years ago, he ran the exact same playbook in Miami, got engaged to the daughter of a real estate developer, convinced the father to invest $500,000 into his offshore fund as a gesture of good faith for the marriage. 2 weeks before the wedding, Vance vanished with the cash. My stomach turned. Did they press charges? "They tried," Elias sighed. But Vance had structured the transfer as a voluntary business investment. It was a civil matter, and the family was too embarrassed by the public humiliation to pursue it through a lengthy trial. They ate the loss. I turned the page. The next document was a marriage certificate. My blood ran cold. "Wait," I breathed, reading the names. "He's married." "Legally, yes," Elias confirmed, his expression hardening. "He married a woman named Sarah Jenkins in Nevada 5 years ago. He drained her savings, maxed out credit cards in her name, and abandoned her. They never formally divorced, which means his marriage to Vanessa is legally void," I finished, the sheer magnitude of the devastation settling over me. Vanessa wasn't a wife. She was a victim of bigamy. I kept flipping. There were records of defaulted loans, repossessed luxury vehicles, and a current, active federal investigation by the SEC regarding wire fraud connected to his fake consultancy firm. He was a walking time bomb, and my parents had eagerly strapped him to my sister's chest. "They won't believe me if I just tell them," I said softly, staring at the irrefutable proof of their impending ruin. "They are too far gone in their delusion. If I just hand them this file, they'll say I fabricated it. They'll say I paid you to forge government documents." "So, what's the play?" Elias asked, leaning forward. They need an audience, I realized, the strategy forming perfectly in my mind. They thrive on social perception. Their entire existence is built on how others view them. The only way to break the delusion is to shatter it publicly, where they can't hide from the truth and where Marcus can't spin his lies. I pulled out a sheet of heavy, personalized stationery from my desk drawer and picked up my fountain pen. I began to write out a formal invitation. "I am hosting a family reconciliation dinner this Friday evening," I told Elias, my voice devoid of any emotion. "At the country club. I want you to arrange for extra security. Have the local authorities on standby, and contact the detective in Florida handling the Vance wire fraud case. Tell him we have his fugitive." Elias nodded, a slow, predatory smile forming on his face. "And your family?" "I will tell them I've reconsidered my position regarding the Rosewood estate," I said, sealing the envelope. "I will tell them we are going to celebrate their new union. They won't be able to resist." I had given them every chance. I had offered my support, my warnings, and my grace. They had chosen to mock me, assault me, and attempt to steal my life's work. They wanted a performance, and I was going to give them a finale they would never, ever forget. The Oak Room at the Crestview Country Club was the epitome of old money prestige. It was a cavernous, dimly lit dining hall adorned with dark mahogany paneling, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of long-dead founders. I had reserved the most prominent table in the center of the room, fully visible to the city's elite who were dining that Friday evening. I arrived early, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal blazer and silk trousers, projecting an image of absolute, unshakable control. At precisely 7 o'clock, The maitre d' escorted my family to the table. Bennett led the charge, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. Natalia was draped in a new cashmere shawl, her head held high, looking down her nose at the other patrons. Vanessa and Marcus trailed behind, holding hands. Marcus wore a perfectly fitted designer suit, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. They honestly believed I had broken. They thought the pressure of their collective harassment had finally cracked my resolve, and I was there to surrender the deed to Rosewood. "Caroline, darling," Natalia cooed, taking her seat and delicately unfolding her linen napkin. "I am so relieved you finally saw reason. Family must always come first. The stress of this week has been simply dreadful for my complexion." "Yes, well," Bennett added, signaling a waiter for a bottle of their most expensive reserve vintage. "It takes a big person to admit when they are wrong. We are willing to let bygones be bygones. Have you brought the transfer documents, or is Arthur meeting us here?" Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his water glass, his eyes locked onto mine with a sickening, predatory gleam. "I have to admit, Caroline, I was beginning to think we'd have to get the courts involved to protect your assets from your work-induced episodes. I'm glad we can handle this quietly. It's much better for everyone's reputation." I sat in silence, letting them dig their graves a little deeper. I studied their faces, the sheer, unadulterated greed masquerading as familial concern. I waited until the waiter had poured their wine and retreated, leaving us in a bubble of tense anticipation amidst the low hum of the surrounding diners. "I didn't bring Arthur," I said finally, my voice calm, smooth, and chillingly quiet. "And I didn't bring the deed to Rosewood." The triumphant smiles vanished instantly. Bennett slammed his wine glass down on the table, the dark red liquid splashing onto the pristine white tablecloth. "What is the meaning of this? You told us this was a reconciliation dinner. You said you had made a decision about the estate." "I did make a decision," I replied, reaching into the leather briefcase resting beside my chair. "I decided that giving my home to a con artist was a poor investment strategy. So instead of a deed, I brought you all wedding gifts." I pulled out 3 thick, black, leather-bound folders and slid one across the polished mahogany table to Bennett, one to Natalia, and the final one directly in front of Vanessa. "What is this?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling slightly as she looked down at the ominous black folder. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside her, his jaw tightening. "Open it," I commanded. Bennett scoffed, a nervous sound, and flipped open the cover. His eyes scanned the first page. I watched the blood completely drain from his face. He blinked rapidly, as if the words on the page were an illusion. This is a background check, Mark Vance." He looked up, utterly bewildered. "Who is Mark Vance?" "Mark Vance is the man sitting next to your daughter," I said, my voice carrying just enough to turn the heads of the affluent patrons at the adjacent tables. "Though I suppose he goes by Marcus today. Keep reading, Bennett." Natalia snatched her folder open, her hands shaking. "Fraud, grand larceny, an active federal warrant." She gasped, dropping the folder as if it had burned her fingers. "Marcus, what is this? Tell me she fabricated this." Marcus lunged across the table, his charming facade completely obliterating into raw, violent panic. He reached for Vanessa's folder, but she had already opened it. She was staring at a brightly colored document with a gold seal. "Vanessa," I said softly, locking eyes with my sister. "That is a marriage certificate from Clark County, Nevada. Dated 5 years ago, he is legally married to a woman named Sarah Jenkins. He drained her life savings, ruined her credit, and disappeared. Which means your lavish, $250,000 wedding last weekend. It was completely void. You aren't his wife. You are just his next mark." "No," Vanessa whimpered, her voice a fragile, broken sound. She looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with sheer terror and disbelief. "Marcus, tell me it's a lie. Tell me she's just trying to ruin us." "Shut up, Vanessa," Marcus hissed, his true, vicious nature finally entirely exposed. He grabbed her arm with bruising force, hauling her upward. "We are leaving right now. This crazy bitch forged all of this." "Let go of her," I demanded, standing up. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The entire dining room was now dead silent, every eye fixed on our table. "You think you're so smart," Marcus snarled, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think these papers mean anything. You're nothing. You're a lonely, pathetic workaholic who can't stand to see anyone else happy." I replied smoothly, "that the two federal marshals and the local police detectives waiting in the lobby disagree with your assessment, Mark." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the oak room swung open. Elias walked in, flanking 3 uniformed officers and 2 plainclothes detectives. They moved with absolute purpose, heading straight for our table. Marcus's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an exit like a trapped rat. He let go of Vanessa and took a step backward, bumping into a waiter. Vanessa stood frozen, staring at the man she had sworn to love, the man she had struck me over. The illusion shattered completely in her mind. The manipulation, the gaslighting, the sudden demands for my house, it all cascaded over her in a violent wave of realization. As Marcus turned to make a desperate run for the kitchen doors, Vanessa reacted. She grabbed her full goblet of red wine and hurled it directly into his face. The heavy crystal struck his jaw, and the dark liquid soaked into his pristine white shirt, resembling a massive, bloody wound. "You monster!" Vanessa screamed, her voice tearing from her throat in a ragged sob of pure agony. "You used me. You stole my life." Marcus stumbled back, blinded by the wine, cursing wildly. Before he could recover, the detectives were on him. They slammed him against the mahogany-paneled wall, forcing his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the silent, affluent dining room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. "Mark Vance," the lead detective said, his voice ringing with authority. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, grand larceny, and bigamy. You have the right to remain silent." As they dragged him out of the room, he continued to thrash and scream profanities, completely shedding any remnant of the sophisticated wealth manager he had pretended to be. Bennett and Natalia sat paralyzed in their chairs. Natalia was quietly weeping into her napkin, while Bennett stared blankly at the table, completely broken. The public humiliation was absolute. Their wealthy peers, the people whose opinions they valued above all else, were watching them with barely concealed disgust. I looked at my parents, feeling no pity, only a cold, profound sense of closure. "There's one more thing," I said, ensuring my voice was low enough for only them to hear. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Since you were so concerned about real estate and asset protection, I ran an audit on your finances, Bennett. I know about the predatory secondary mortgage you took out to pay for the illusion of wealth. I know you were weeks away from foreclosure." Bennett looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, desperate hope. "Caroline, you paid it. You saved the house." "I didn't pay it off," I corrected him, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Vertex Holdings, my company, bought the debt from your lender. I own your mortgage. And because you are currently in violation of 3 different financial covenants, I am calling the loan due immediately. In full." Natalia gasped, dropping her napkin. "Caroline, please, you can't do this. We are your parents. You would throw us out on the street." "You demanded I give up my home for a criminal because I didn't deserve it," I reminded them coldly. "You allowed my sister to strike me in public, and you laughed. You have treated me as nothing more than a bank account for my entire life. I am not throwing you out. You evicted yourselves the moment you decided your greed was more important than your daughter." I turned away from them, leaving the papers on the table. They were bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and entirely cut off. They had engineered their own absolute ruin. The weeks that followed the disaster at the country club were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and profound, structural life changes. Mark Vance's trial was swift and brutal. The evidence Elias and I had handed to the federal prosecutors was airtight. The fake corporate entities, the offshore wire transfers, the forged marriage license. It was an ironclad case. He took a plea deal to avoid decades in prison, but he was still sentenced to 15 years in federal lockup, with mandatory restitution that guaranteed he would never see a dime of luxury for the rest of his natural life. I used my corporate legal team to ensure that the true Mrs. Jenkins in Nevada received the lion's share of the seized assets. My parents, true to form, attempted to fight the foreclosure. They hired cheap lawyers, tried to claim elder abuse, and even attempted to sell their story to trashy tabloid websites. But Vertex Holdings' legal division crushed every attempt with clinical efficiency. 3 months after the wedding, Bennett and Natalia were officially evicted from the sprawling estate they couldn't afford. Without my silent financial support, their facade collapsed entirely. They moved into a small, rented condominium in a neighboring state, completely exiled from the high society circles they had sacrificed everything to remain a part of. I changed my phone number and instructed my security team to block them from the Rosewood property permanently. The silence that descended upon my life was not lonely. It was profoundly peaceful. One crisp, autumn afternoon, 4 months after the dramatic climax, I was sitting in the conservatory of my home reviewing a new software acquisition when the intercom chimed. It was the front gate security. "Ms. Caroline, your sister is here. She is requesting entry," the guard announced. I hesitated for a long moment. Vanessa and I had not spoken since the night Marcus was arrested. I had arranged for an annulment lawyer to handle her case, footing the bill anonymously, but I had kept my distance. I told the guard to let her through. A few minutes later, I walked out to the grand front porch. Vanessa stepped out of a modest, used sedan, a far cry from the luxury SUVs she was accustomed to. She looked entirely different. The expensive hair extensions were gone, replaced by a simple, shoulder-length cut. She wore jeans and a plain sweater. She looked exhausted, humbled, but for the first time in her life, she looked real. She walked up the steps slowly, stopping a few feet away from me. She didn't look entitled, she looked terrified. "Thank you for letting me in," Vanessa said, her voice quiet and raspy. "Why are you here, Vanessa?" I asked gently, leaning against a white pillar. She took a deep breath, tears immediately pooling in her eyes. "To apologize and to say thank you." She crossed her arms, shivering slightly in the autumn breeze. "The lawyer you sent. He told me you paid his retainer. He told me you shielded my name from the press during the fraud trial. You protected me even after everything I did to you." "You were a victim, Vanessa," I said softly. "He targeted your vanity and Mom and Dad's greed. He weaponized your flaws against you." "But I let him," she cried, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with heavy sobs. "I hit you, Caroline. I struck my own sister because I was so brainwashed by the idea of this perfect, wealthy life that I thought you were the enemy. I was horrible to you. For years. I expected you to just carry me forever, and I never once asked how heavy the burden was." I walked over to her and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "It was heavy," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. "It almost broke me." "I am so sorry," she wept, looking at me with genuine, profound remorse. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I see what Mom and Dad did. I see what I became. I got a job, Caro. I'm working as an administrative assistant at a dental office. It's hard and I'm struggling, but I'm doing it on my own. I want to be better." Looking at her, stripped of the toxic influence of our parents and the manipulative grooming of a con artist, I saw the sister I had always hoped to have. The anger that had burned inside me for so long simply wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced by a quiet, protective strength. "Forgiveness takes time, Vanessa," I said, reaching out and pulling her into a tentative, gentle embrace. She collapsed against my shoulder, holding on to me like a lifeline. "But we have time. We can start over. No more secrets, no more demands, just us." As we stood there on the porch of the home I had built with my own hands, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the changing seasons, I felt a deep, abiding sense of vindication. I had survived the fire of their betrayal, and in doing so, I had burned away the toxic ties that had held me down. I had secured my empire, protected my peace, and salvaged the one piece of my family that was willing to grow. I was no longer the silent, suffering daughter. I was the architect of my own life, and the foundation was finally, immovably secure.